Hi, Troy. I'm wondering if where everybody. Oh, there's more people. Okay, fabulous. No worries if you are early. That's fine. That lets me know everything's working, so that's good. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and get started because I am trying to cram a lot of information in this. So hopefully we'll get through everything and then be able to have questions at the end. So my name is Jade Grisham. I am an urban ag educator here at Marion County Purdue Extension. And I am new to beekeeping. I've had bees since about April and I've been researching it since last fall. Um, so this whole new fascinating journey has, I think, allowed me to keep that new perspective on what people are curious about. So we'll get into a bunch of that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Dun, dun, dun. I can. There we go. There. Okay, fabulous. Um, so this presentation is not going to be, you're going to be able to go get bees tomorrow, which is probably a good thing because it's fall and it's not the right season to get bees. But also, um, when you're getting into this, it's good to sort of know what you're getting into before you decide, okay, this is what I want to do. I want to try and get supplies and learn more about doing this. And the best time to do all that thinking and planning is in the fall and winter. So this is good timing. Um, The first question you might want to ask yourself is why would you want to keep bees or why are you curious about bees? One of the biggest components of that, what's most interesting to me, is this emotional appeal of it. Um, Getting into a beehive the first time, it's difficult to describe what it's like, but you hear um, the buzzing of the bees, which over time you get to sort of hear what the general emotional state they're in from the different buzzing noises. And then when you're peeling apart different parts of the hive or popping the different parts of the hive open, you're hearing like all those different sounds. And then it smells amazing. You've got the smoke smell from the smoker and the wood from the hive box and the wax and the honey. And bees use this glue called propolis that I think smells like red hots, like the candy or cinnamon. And each of the smells that you get from the inside of the hive sort of change with the seasons, which is it's a very immersive experience. I think very calming and relaxing. Certainly not the first time you get into a beehive, but as you get used to it and more comfortable. Um, I want to try and share a video with you. see if I can get this to work. And I've muted it because the sound isn't as important. But really, when you get into a beehive for the first time, you know, you hear the gentle buzzing noises, and then you're looking inside the honeycomb to inspect for different types of life that are happening. In this video, you can see grubs developing inside the honeycomb. You can see little bits of nectar that they're filling up that'll eventually dry to be honey. And you can see there's some capped honeycomb spaces. Those are baby bees that are pupating. And then you can see these two bees are popping out. They're both drones, and they're newly emerged. They're cleaning off, and the workers kind of let them do this themselves. Sometimes the workers will help the younger other worker bees, but they usually leave the drones to fend for themselves. And so cool to watch. You can see a lot of these workers have their heads down, either feeding baby bees, or assuming this beekeeper was using some smoke, they might be actually feeding as like what part of the smoke response. So you can see this guy just barely hatched out. He's very wobbly, but you can see how much larger he is than the other ones too. Let's go back to the other thing. This is going to be playing in the background if I don't get rid of that. Okay. All right, other cool things besides just the sensory experience of it, especially for youth, is being able to start conversations about teamwork and sharing and caring for others. A hive is a collective sort of organism, a colony, and that has a lot of parallels to our society. There are people who study and talk about how bee colony interactions can have mirrored implications for human democracy, and there's all sorts of interesting social and governmental ideals that can be analogous to beekeeping, which is fascinating. And then, especially again for kids, building confidence around bugs. I am not a big bug person, which is weird because it's part of my job and I'm a beekeeper now. But I think I've seen myself grow a lot in my confidence, especially around wasps or bugs that I definitely avoided. I understand better a lot of their behaviors, and that confidence has been really cool. And I've been able to see that too in my daughter. I have a 9-year-old daughter who has done a little bit of beekeeping with me. So one of the other exciting things is then, especially in the winter when you're not out in the beehives all the time, is being able to use honey, wax, even the propolis to create more things. Lotion, soap, chapstick, baked goods with honey. You can whip up the honey to make whipped honey and add flavorings to it and all kinds of things. So my daughter has started sculpting the wax. It wasn't intentional. I left it on the counter and she used it as a craft supply. And when it's warm, the wax is malleable, and she was sculpting it into little dragons. So that's been fun. Another cool thing that I kind of wish I would have done with her is have her write or talk or record her talking about what she thinks beekeeping will be like before she got into a hive, and then after, to sort of see how much she observed and record that journey for her. So I think that would be a fun activity to do. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to share activities that adults or parents can do with kids to sort of help them get involved, and maybe you could use it as like a homeschool tie-in, or in the summer as like a way to refresh on some school skills, or potentially like a 4-H project, or probably Scouts. I'm not as familiar with Scouts, but other youth programs I'm sure could have beekeeping tie-ins. So that's sort of the emotional appeal. There's also a lot of practical appeals to beekeeping, especially if you have sort of this goal of a homestead or an urban homestead. Bees provide pollination for a lot of our plants. They can be a sweetener, which there are not a lot of unless you're growing a lot of food and processing them as sweeteners. There's not a lot of that. And then technically, you can eat bees in their larval form. Some people intentionally cull the drone brood as like a pest management measure. Drones are the vector for mites sometimes. And I have heard of people sauteing up the little underdeveloped grubs to eat. I don't know if I would ever do that myself, but it's an interesting concept for sure. So maybe protein. I have 2 hives. For me, that amount of work in the summer averages out to be about 2 hours a week. For a beginning beekeeper, there's going to be a lot of learning on the side and shopping online last minute for me. So that might be a little bit of an underestimation, but as the years go on, I could see that being the average. An established hive, however, can produce 5 gallons of honey in 1 year. So I have 2 hives. Eventually, hopefully, each hive will be able to net the 5 gallons of honey. That's like a 5-gallon bucket, and that's really heavy because 16 ounces by weight of honey is only 12 ounces by volume. So 5 gallons is significantly heavy, and heavier than it would be if it was full of like milk or water. And then you can also collect wax, not as much because I think the ratio bees ingest honey and nectar to produce wax, and I think the ratio is like 8 to 1. And a lot of beekeepers wind up collecting the wax and then reusing it in the hives the next year to help the bees get established. So wax production as a business or as a significant production isn't as much. The nice thing for me, one of the appeals is that there's very little off-season work in winter. You put your garden to bed, you sort of put your beehives to bed effectively. You can't get in the hives if it's too cold or the weather is too adverse. It can put them at risk, especially in the winter. So you actually can't get out in the hives when it's too cold, which is kind of nice. The other thing is I can kind of think about it like when I go on vacation, I can take a 1 to 2 week break and I'm not concerned about the bees. They can pretty much take care of themselves for that long. The only real reason I need to be getting into the hives regularly is to check for diseases, because when a disease hits, it can wipe out a colony. And a colony is like a $300 investment just for the bees themselves. And if it's a good colony, I might value that higher. So while I could not get into the hives at all, and maybe they would be fine, if I can catch those disease and do a $10 treatment and prevent myself from losing that whole colony, then that's ideal for me. So that's why we're getting in the hives regularly. But 1 to 2 weeks on vacation with nobody getting in the hives isn't going to hurt anything. You can kind of think of it like mowing your lawn. If you can leave, not have your lawn be super overgrown, then you can probably keep the bees at home that long. I will say beekeeping has a fairly high startup cost. All the equipment is very specialized, but you can borrow a little bit at the beginning and that can help. And then good equipment can last for years, especially if you learn how to take care of it. The other nice thing about beekeeping is it can be really nice for urban spaces. People have kept hives on top of houses, on top of fairly tall houses too, although that's less advisable. You can do, your really tiny front yard, backyard row houses even. They don't need very much clearance. We'll talk about this a little bit when we talk about where to place your hive on your property. But you can have up to 8 hives on your property in Indianapolis. So, and currently there is a proposed, I think it's still not officially a law, that HOAs can't prevent you from having beehives. But you will still be held accountable for taking care of them. And we'll get into that more later. I will say, well, we'll talk about that later. I'll keep it to myself for now. Okay. So a little bit about bee biology. This is where it gets really fascinating for me because I'm a biology nerd. The queen actually has one of the fastest developments. Even though she has the longest lifespan, she has a really fast development. And that's because without a queen, a hive is basically a zombie. Like it can't continue to survive for very long without a queen because she is the one that's laying the eggs. So her life phase, her development happens really fast because if the hive doesn't have a queen, they need to be able to get a queen as quickly as possible. So she will only be a little larva for about 2 weeks from egg to emergence. Oh, maybe a little bit longer, but whereas the worker bees and drones you can see in this like little picture off to the side are going to be more like 3 weeks or a little bit more than 3 weeks. If you can picture, and I'm sure you guys have read The Very Hungry Caterpillar, where we have like a little egg and it hatches and becomes a caterpillar and then eats a bunch of leaves and turns into a butterfly after it's in a chrysalis. Well, in a beehive, the honeycomb that you're looking at is basically hundreds of conjoined chrysalises. Bees have a complete metamorphosis, just like butterflies and moths, and they spend that first, it's almost half of their lifespan as a little grub, maybe a third, living in the bottom of each of these little honeycomb cells. And the grub grows and gets chunkier and squish it up against the side of the cell. And eventually the worker bees will cap that. So that little grub, unlike, a butterfly, which makes its own chrysalis, is placed into a honeycomb, and then the worker bees cap that off and they pupate inside there and then emerge as adults, granted clumsy adults, right? Like we saw in the video. The drones and the queens are both larger, about twice the weight of a worker bee, but the drones are built like teddy bears kind of, and they flap their wings at a lower rate, I think is what it was. To my ears, it makes them sound louder. And whereas the honeybee worker bee sounds like a higher sort of buzz, drones have a much louder buzz, and I can hear them, especially in the spring when there are more drones, you can hear them, which is fun to be able to tell the difference. Their eyes are also a little bit larger and they touch on the top of their little heads, whereas the worker bee's eyes don't quite touch. And the queens have this really long abdomen so that she can reach all the way down inside the honeycomb cells to be able to lay an egg right in the middle. Just random facts, bees will reuse wax. They'll chew it, remove it, place it somewhere else for brood, but they use new clean wax for honey, which is awesome for sanitary purposes of harvesting it for food. Something you could do with kids is try and represent this information both in this graph and in other graphs on the internet in a new way. Have them reshape it so that they can understand it and reiterate and recreate that. Maybe have them practice teaching it, because that's how it helps you absorb information, at least for me. Okay, once a worker bee comes out of that cell, is fully an adult, they go through a series of jobs inside the hive. At first, they're responsible for cleaning and polishing the cells. They emerge and they almost immediately get to work. The reason they polish the inside of those honeycomb cells is to then prepare them for new eggs to be laid by the queen. And when they're done polishing, they're kind of milky, like a dark opal sort of color. It's really beautiful. And then as they get a little older, they will turn into the nurse bees that then take care of the other babies. They'll consume different types of food, chew them up, feed the babies, and as they get a little bit older, they will start building comb. Where beeswax comes from is on the underside of the bee's abdomen. There's all where those little like stripes are where they will excrete little scales of wax. And when this wax comes off, the other bees collect it, chew it up, and reshape it to be new honeycomb. So that's one of their jobs when they're building the comb, is actually because biologically their bodies are the right age to produce wax. They also help ripen the nectar, which is where nectar goes from being nectar to honey, and undertaker duty, where they'll pull out dead bees and help clean the hive. And then as they get a little bit older, they'll move down to where the entrance of the hive is, which is usually at the bottom, and they will be on guard duty. This is also when they start actually practicing flying around outside the hive. So if you've been keeping track, At this point, the bee's been alive as an adult for almost 3 weeks, but prior to that was a pupa, a little baby, for about 2, give or take a couple of days, weeks. So at this point, they're almost like a month and a half old, but they've never left the hive. But then they'll go out and they'll do these orientation flights, and they'll sort of learn how to see their way around outside, and then they'll start practicing for foraging, where they will collect water to bring back to cool the hive, and they'll collect pollen, which is their source of protein, and then they'll collect nectar, and they'll collect supplies for propolis, which includes actually tree sap. So yeah, propolis is an interesting substance. But one of the cute things online is you can see a lot of illustrated children's books or diagrams will show the different bee jobs as like a bee in different types of clothing, which is sort of a cartooned way of presenting it. But for kids, that can help them internalize, okay, the bee has this job, and this is maybe how I imagine the bee having like a little hard hat when they're a builder or something. So I think that could be a cute way for kids to do that. Actually, I have like a little bee model, and I really want to make clothes for my little bee model. So if anyone has a kid that wants to make clothes for a little plastic bee, that would be great. I would totally get their help. One of the interesting things about bees and insects in general is that their genetics are a little different than humans. We refer to drones as male and queens and workers as female, but those descriptions aren't fully encompassing maybe what it means, and it certainly isn't very analogous to humans. So queens and worker bees have 32 chromosomes. They have 16 types of chromosome and then 32, so that each is a pair, right? Just like in humans, we have 46 chromosomes, 23 types, and each one is a pair. So for humans, male chromosomes will have an X and a Y, and females have X and X, right? In honeybees, the females are diploid, so they have the 2 copies, and the males are haploid, so they only have 1 copy. So a queen bee can lay an unfertilized egg, and it will become a drone because it'll only have half those genetics. Whereas a fertilized egg will have the 16 chromosomes from the queen and the 16 chromosomes from whatever random drone she mated with. And those will then be laid and produce potentially another queen if she's fed the right food, or another worker bee, and we'll consider those female again. So kind of different than humans, but we call them male and female because for our brains, it's easier to think about it that way. And just like in humans and bees, genetics is kind of going to determine what you look like or act like, but it's not the whole story. Gene expression is then controlled by things in our environment, like the difference between a worker and a queen. I would be really curious to know if this is transferable to a bunch of other native pollinators or solitary bees, if they're also diploid and haploid. That would be a fun thing for an older kid to research, or for me, I guess. I'm an older kid, right? Okay, so that's the individual sort of life cycle, but a colony as a collection of bees also has sort of a life cycle, and their life cycle follows seasonal availability of resources. So we can see in this diagram, this is 2 years, and it's showing us our bee population. This is in a single hive. So a hive has tens of thousands of bees. Usually we measure them by weight or volume because counting them is impossible. They move too much, frankly. So we can see, and like this might be slightly different depending on where you live in the United States, but we can see that pollen really peak. We can see the peak for tree pollen in very early spring, maybe late winter. And then we can see a secondary peak for other things. And then in October-ish, where we're right about now, we can see a peak with goldenrod and asters and a lot of our fall flowers, which are essential. Frequently, as beekeepers, we'll allow the bees to collect all the spring bounty and grow their colony, and then we'll take that excess off, and that's our harvest. That's where you get the 5 gallons of honey, ideally. And then for that fall, everything those bees collect, and sometimes beekeepers will supplement this, will be what they use to survive the winter. So a beekeeper has to maintain this balance, and there's lots of ways that you can do this, but making sure that the bees have enough to survive that winter. And you can see how greatly diminished their population is. They'll huddle together in a tight little ball to keep warm, dislocating their wing joints and then flapping and buzzing and vibrating to keep each other warm. Kind of like weird penguins, if you think about that. However, this bee population curve can also be affected by things like diseases and pests that want to move in. If you can imagine, the bees are keeping this hive warm in the winter and is full of honey and pollen and the insects themselves. So for a creature like a mouse, a hive would be a really great place to live if you don't get stung to death. So beekeepers also have to sort of think about what other kinds of animals might want to take advantage of this amazing winter resource. For youth and for us as beekeepers to track this over years is really useful for our records, but then it can also be a really good experience for children to see, how children think about time, where they watch a tree change over the year, and then that tree's already been alive longer than their parents maybe. Whereas bees and the colony change over the year, but that bee life cycle is much shorter and much easier for a young person to comprehend, because it's only about 4 weeks, and sometimes attention spans are about that long. So looking at the phenology of something and comparing it to trees or plants or themselves is fascinating. Okay, the other cool thing about bees is that they can see and sense things differently than us, and studying that is fascinating. So these are pictures of flowers with a UV filter applied to them when they took the photo. Because bees can see a color, and my brain thinks about it as if it was a color, knowing that all I can see is visible light. But I don't really know what that would be like for a bee. They can see ultraviolet light, which means beyond violet. So when we're looking at a flower, we might see a solid yellow color because our eyes don't pick up UV light. But for a bee, they see the difference between the UV light bouncing off and not bouncing off. So they would kind of see it as a color, I guess, and representing it for human eyes to be able to see is interesting because we can't see it. So in these artist depictions, you can see one artist did like a blue, white, pink, and most of them do white and black to show the difference. So if you can figure out how to, I'm not a photography nerd, but if you could figure out how to do that UV filter technique, you could take pictures of all the different flowers that you see over a year and compare them. I would totally go to an exhibit of just pictures of flowers that are showing UV light. The other thing about bees is their eyes are compound, which is a lot of our flying insects have compound eyes. Essentially, lots of eyes pointed different directions spread over a sort of spherical shape that are feeding information simultaneously. The resolution isn't great, we don't think, on their eyes, but they can see such a broad range of vision that it helps them sense things coming from the sides. Or for our insects that have compound eyes that are predators, maybe like dragonflies, they have higher resolution. I don't think bees have as good a resolution of eyes as dragonflies do. But these pictures off to the side sort of try and help you imagine what that would be like at the lower resolution and a higher resolution. But again, this isn't showing a full 180-degree thing. I'm sure creating this little camera that mimics a compound eye was not easy, and doing it over a bigger surface would probably be complicated. Another thing, bees are different from us. They have the ability to sense with their feet, where we normally think of maybe touching our food and experiencing the texture. Like if you've ever been around a toddler, that's how they experience their food first. They poke their fingers in it. Bees can actually just taste with their feet, so they sort of short circuit that whole thing. In their tarsi, jointed parts at the base of their feet, they have sensilla, which they use both in their feet and then also their mouth area and antenna to be able to sense for sugary substances. They can also, I think partially by virtue of being small and very hairy, sense electrical changes in flowers to be able to tell whether or not they have been pollinated already. And then it helps the pollen stick to them too, which is really cool. So what do bees eat and drink? Bees they need water, just like other organisms, but they seem to prefer open water sources and dirty water sources. So if you have a muddy puddle or a cattle feeding trough, that can be one of their favorite places to drink. I've heard a lot of theories where that's because of the mineral availability of the water. Lots of people have fancy bubbling fountains to try and attract their bees, and the bees will just go for their neighbor's dirty swimming pool in the backyard that's been neglected instead. So being conscious of where the water sources are on your property, because the bees will find them, they'll need them, and ideally you don't want them to be where your neighbors will be annoyed at you. They also they need nectar or anything sweet or sugary. This time of year, or whenever there's a dearth in the availability of nectar, they will go for anything. The ketchup on your burger, the spilled soda on your picnic table, wherever they will find it. They're very resourceful. They need to consume pollen, which is their source of protein. They are not like other pollinators that will also eat other insects. They do sometimes eat the larvae that are damaged, especially like when I bumble around in the hive and I squish larvae. They will consume those to use the nutrients, but other than that, they don't really consume other insects. And then they'll actually take the pollen and nectar and chew it up, and between the little bits of bacteria and fungi on all of those, on themselves and all those products, they'll pack it into the cells, and it makes sort of a fermented pollen fungal product. It's basically bread, and we call it bee bread, and they consume that. In this picture, you can see the bright yellow pollen that's a little bit fresher, and then the sort of honeyed, caramelized looking cells that I think are probably the bee bread. And then you can also see the unfinished nectar, which is sort of glossy in the bottom, and then the grubs here and some capped brood. There's lots of things you can do for kids around bees and food. I am really interested to know if bees have a preference for different types of sugar, or you can add different additives to the sugar, like different essential oils to help prevent the sugar water that you feed them from going bad. And if I knew their preference for those things, that would be really nice. Okay, so let's say I've convinced you, you think bees are fascinating, and you didn't think that before this for some reason, but they're cool. And you maybe would be interested in getting into a hive, but like still not sure about keeping bees. You can totally try beekeeping just once. The main hurdle for you are going to be finding a place to borrow a suit and coordinating a time with a beekeeper to join them. As a beekeeper, I love it when people want to come and help me and like hang out while I'm in the beehives, because having a second set of hands is really useful. And it gives me someone to talk to while I'm out there. But the best way to find these people, you can look on Facebook, of course, or social media. You can also attend local beekeeper meetings. The Beekeepers of Indiana is sort of our state organization, and then there are broken into different associations regionally. So here in Indianapolis, we have the Central Indiana Beekeepers Association, or CIBA, and we meet on Monday nights. I think it's the third week. It's on their website, this Central Indiana Beekeepers Association, and usually from 6:30 to 8:30 at Holiday Park Nature Center. So you can just show up and talk to people and see if anyone will invite you. Just sort of insert yourself. If you talk to, what I did was I talked to the people in charge, and I said, hey, I'd really love to get a mentor. And I found a friend and that was also new like me, and together we went and sort of, yeah, it's awesome. So definitely doing the mentor route can be helpful. I found a used suit because I was pretty sure I wanted to keep doing this, but you can also find a suit to borrow. Another really useful source is online videos. Just be aware that beekeeping is sort of regional, just like gardening. beekeepers in Florida or New Zealand or Australia are going to have different techniques because they have different pest pressures and different environmental resource schedule, right? Like their flowers are blooming at different times. Yeah, for youth are welcome so far from what I've seen to attend the Beekeepers of Indiana, our SEBA meetings. I've seen youth there, but it can be it's not geared towards children. So if you are curious about beekeeping, you can join 4-H and start a beekeeping club near you and meet with other kids that want to do it too. Another thing you can do, especially for kids, go to the library and check out books. There are tons of really cute books about beekeeping and bees and native bees too. I didn't include the native bee ones, but they exist. You can have your kids read books. You can read to your kids. You can have your kids read to older kids, read to younger kids. I think it would be really cute to have your kid read to bees, like take them on a picnic blanket outside next to some flowers and just read to the bees. You can have kids read and write or illustrate their own books, which is fun. Definitely getting out there and writing is good. Okay, so you've got somebody who will let you get into your hive. Then what? What do you expect your first time? So most beekeepers use what are called Langstroth hives. They were developed in 1851, and honestly, that development revolutionized beekeeping. Prior to this, they were kept in what was known as skeps, which were like kind of those basket lid bell-shaped things. And keeping bees in those usually required the destruction of the colony to harvest anything out of them, which made it really difficult. So Langstroth came up with this design, and while there is some tweaking that's been done with, especially with new technologies, with plastic and other materials that hives can be made with, this general design has been around for 175 years at this point. So usually you've got at the top, you've got a telescoping top cover, frequently covered in metal. Sometimes people get fancy and get like a peaked roof, which isn't necessary, but it looks nice. And then underneath that, you have an inner cover. I think that just makes it easier to lift off the lid. So each box below that can have either 10 frames or 8 frames. Theoretically, it could have another number if you made them yourself, but most commercially available beehive kits are going to be either 8 frame or 10 frame. 10 frame was the original design. Having 10 frames in a hive makes the box a little bit bigger and makes the box a little heavier, but you can, if you imagined having 10 frames in each of those ones as you stack them up, you can kind of have a bigger hive that's not quite as tall. Each of those boxes, when full of brood and honey and bees, can weigh 80 to 90 pounds. And so lifting those off, especially because the bees glue them together with the propolis, can actually be really difficult and require a fair amount of strength. And as you get older and still want to keep bees, bearing in mind how difficult it is to lift apart these boxes, you might choose to go for an 8 frame just because they're a little bit lighter, but then your hive might get a little bit taller. There's been a little bit of research that I was reading that said that 8 frames are a little closer to the ideal size for overwintering, but I didn't see enough to convince me that that was like a hard fact. For me, when I purchased my hive this spring, this exact kit was about $110, but I had to put it all together. And then when you're done, you have to coat the outside in either paint or some sort of sealant that's safe for bees, or let it off gas so then it becomes safe for bees and will prevent the wood from falling apart. Usually the wood that these are made out of is sort of cheap. Oh, and then there's different sizes of boxes. So there's 3 general sizes. There's a deep box, which is usually used for brood, because again, they're heavy. You know, a deep box full of honey is like kind of weigh like 100 pounds. There's a medium box, which people usually use for honey. And frequently they're separated by a queen excluder. Not everyone uses these, but some beekeepers do. The queen excluder prevents the queen from moving up into where they keep the honey. She just lays eggs, she stays in the bottom. The worker bees can get up and fill the top with honey, and then when you go to harvest it, there's no little baby bees in there, or grubs. However, true story, you can also accidentally trap the queen in the top box if you're not careful, and then you will only have brood where the honey is. Bees do naturally sort of tend to store honey above where they keep brood, so you might be fine without a queen excluder, and then you don't run the risk of accidentally trapping the queen in the top box like I did. The deep frames for brood are frequently have, there's a couple different types of foundation. So these two things at the bottom are frames. So they have a little bump on either side at the top where they rest on a ridge inside the box. If you imagine a hive box kind of like a library, where each of these gaps between the frames is like the aisle, where on either side there would be books all the way up and down. But instead of books in the beehive, it's honeycomb full of baby bees and honey and stuff. So when they walk in, they're sort of perpendicular. Yeah, you guys can picture it. The brood frames are usually the longer ones if you get them on plastic. So this is like a little plastic sheet that's been sprayed with beeswax. It's black because it's easier to see eggs on a black surface, whereas the yellow looks nicer with honey, and you don't need to look for eggs on the yellow one. So, and then that helps you visually see the different sizes from a distance. So as you're grabbing things and moving things around and your brain is all kinds of places, having different colors for different sizes helps. So I got an 8-frame box because I don't have the upper body strength, and I was worried I wouldn't be able to lift them. It's manageable, but I do like that I got the 8-frame boxes for myself. Having kids be able to keep a budget, decorate the hives is really fun. I got to paint mine, and I was really excited about doing some sort of fancy design. And then I kind of ran out of time to do the fancier design that I wanted to, but okay, what to wear. So as far as a bee suit goes, especially your first time, I would recommend getting a full body bee suit. It's gonna enable you to be better protected and not have to worry about whether your shirt's tucked in or any of that. And it's just one piece of clothing. If you're getting it used, you'll want to wash it by hand. When bees are panicked, they produce an alarm pheromone, and if a previous beekeeper was stung a lot, the suit could be actually kind of covered in that alarm pheromone, and it's good to have a fresh start. So washing your also is a used piece of clothing, and you should probably wash it. So wash it if you get it used, and sometimes even if you don't. This is my daughter when we got her kid suit. She has a canvas one. And then we tried to find kid-sized gloves, but we had to order them and they didn't come in time. So we got creative and took a pair of gardening gloves and duct taped them. Not a great long-term solution because the duct tape came off eventually, but good for intermediate solution, right? For me and for my daughter, it was important that we pull our hair back and plan to be able to sweat. And you have a veil over your face so you can't like wipe it off or anything. So stuff's gonna drip in your eyes and it's gonna sting. And if you have like a little sweatband on, that helps immensely. Wear sturdy, comfy shoes and socks. Your little mesh tennis shoes, like what my daughter's wearing in this picture, you can get stung through those. If you have some like leatherwork type boots, those are good. She actually wore her winter boots the first time we went out. She was really hot and she complained about it, but she was more confident working with bees. And ultimately, when you pick a suit, that's what you want. You want to be confident and comfortable getting out into the hive. And over time, you can change maybe you only wear a jacket or you wear lighter gloves. That's fine. But at first, be at your maximum comfort around the bees. That's ideal. They can get kind of expensive though, suits. Especially when your kid's going to grow out of them. So being able to find one used is possible and nice. The white canvas ones can also serve as a crafting surface. So there's no reason you can't have a colorful suit. White is traditional and looks clean and maybe is less aggressive looking because there's no predator animals that are large and white here that bees might think of, but really bees have a memory and will figure it out, and they'll, at least while they're alive, they'll recognize you eventually. So wearing dark colors is also okay. You'll just also be warmer too. So it's fine to decorate your suit if it's canvas, and you can. The type of suit I got is the one in the top right. I got a triple mesh suit. I wanted to be able to not sweat as much. The canvas ones are cheaper generally. They're probably lighter weight because there's only one layer of fabric, but they could be heavier maybe. My triple mesh suit is pretty heavy. The other thing is that they usually come in unisex, kind of made for men's sizes. So if you're small or short and petite, it might be trickier. You'll just have more suit pooling around your feet, which is fine. That won't hurt anything. They're just a little big. The triple mesh has a mesh on the inside and then basically like that carpet foamy non-skid stuff, and then more mesh on the outside, and it sort of pinches their little feet when they land on you. They don't really like to land on it very much, and it helps wind blow through it. It can be a little itchy to wear though if you're wearing like a t-shirt and shorts and you like pull your arms together and push the mesh up against your skin. It can be kind of itchy. But oh, it's nice if there's a breeze. What you'll want to do and look for, especially if you're going on the cheaper side, is to make sure that the zippers are sturdy material and that the stitching is good. If you can look at close-up pictures of the beekeeping suit, wherever the zippers meet each other and there's opportunities for bees to be able to climb in, you want it to be sort of secondary security with like Velcro or something like this picture. Bees, when they fall to the ground, their inclination is usually not to fly, but to crawl, especially if those bees are young and they haven't actually ever been outside the hive. They're not great at orienteering yet. So they will find your shoe and will just crawl up. Your goal as a beekeeper is to prevent that crawling up from being able to crawl up inside your pant leg or inside your shirt or inside your veil, right? Because then the bees are trapped, they're squished, and they panic, and that's when they'll sting you. They're not like trying to get into your suit. They're just trying to go up to figure out how do they get home. So if you secure the base of the foot of your suit or your pants inside your shoes, or make sure that there's some good elastic, that'll go a long way to helping you. Another thing you'll want to have your first time is gloves. This is my gloves after like 3 months of use. They're covered in propolis and bee poop and ash and very normal looking gloves. Again, they tend to run in men's sizes if you have small hands. These are actually a size small and they're still too big for me. You might have to go to youth sizes as an adult, but that's okay. Usually the leather versions are made out of goat skin, but as you get more comfortable with beekeeping, a lot of beekeepers use vinyl gloves or no gloves, depending on what they're working with, because you still want to keep the propolis and the honey off your hands because you don't want to get all sticky. But the leather can be kind of cumbersome, and having greater dexterity actually allows you to prevent injury to the bees, which can lower them ever releasing that alarm pheromone and can make it easier. So a lot of confident beekeepers swear by not having big clunky gloves on, but I have seen it sort of progress. Whereas I get more comfortable, I was like, okay, maybe I could do a thinner glove and be more confident. The other thing I would recommend, so you've got suit, gloves, proper clothing and shoes underneath those, is a hive tool. I like the hive tool to have a J-hook. You can see in the picture, this person is using that J-hook to pull up the little lip on the sides of the frame. That's how it rests in the hive, and the bees will cover that in propolis, which is that it's like if you could scrape off all the stuff on fly paper and then sort of mix it with silly putty. It's like that consistency when it's warm. When it gets cool, it's more shatter. It breaks and is like crunchy, kind of like caramel. But when it's warm outside and when it's in the hive, it's sticky and messy, and it makes it really difficult to pull the frames up with just your hands. You kind of need a tool to use leverage to pop them off, especially without injuring any bees, because you can see how big that that guy's gloves are, he's not going to be able to reach in between the frames very well without smashing a bunch of honeycomb and stuff. So having a little tool, these tools will usually also have a flat sort of putty knife side, which is good because the bees will build burr comb on top of the frames. And sometimes they'll start laying eggs in it, they'll put honey in it. And as a beekeeper, it's harder to work around because it'll attract bees. And so you just scrape that off and you try and keep the tops of these clean. And the putty knife side is good for that. Okay, skills when you get into the hive the first time. Being able to light your smoker is really good. I have a bunch of mature oak trees, and so whenever I mow the lawn, we just collect the sticks, break them up, and stick them in this metal bucket next to our front door, which is actually also where I keep my smoker. I don't think it's a good idea to keep your smoker outside, but that's where I keep mine. It's sort of sheltered and up against the house, and it means I know where it is and it's not getting ash all over in our coat closet. So my daughter likes to help me with this process. It still kind of makes me nervous. And I have a candle warmer and I sew. So I have scraps of like cotton and stuff floating around the house. I'll use the scraps of cotton, soak up my used up wax that doesn't smell very much anymore. And they make great fire starters. I'll light one of them, stick it in the bottom of the smoker with some of the larger sticks, and then put some smaller sticks on top. Basically, you're lighting like the same process you would for lighting charcoal or any other number of things. The goal is to make smoke that is not too hot and is ideally pretty thick. The reason you want to smoke bees is because the bees are arboreal. They normally live inside hollowed out trees. And when they smell smoke, they go into emergency response. They think that their house is going to be destroyed. So they're all going to eat a bunch of honey to prepare for this emergency flight. And the smoke also obscures their pheromones. So if one bee alerts and does that alarm pheromone release, normally that would trigger the rest of the bees to start coming out and being aggressive and attacking whatever the first bee is alerting about. But with the smoke, it prevents those pheromones from being sensed as well. So that is part of the goal of the smoke. And then all the bees have their heads down in the nectar cells, like gorging themselves. And theoretically, they've eaten a bunch and they get kind of lethargic. So between those three things, the smoke helps you as a beekeeper keep the bees from freaking out and attacking you. They're focused on eating, they're focused on gorging themselves, and they can't smell each other very well. You don't want it to be too hot though, because you don't want to burn your bees. That would be bad. When you're setting down your smoker, because you're using it the whole time, make sure you have somewhere to set it down that's not like dry grass. The bottom of the smoker will get hot enough to like burn things. And then you'll want to puff it occasionally to get, there's a little hole right at the base of this metal can where the air flows from here into here. Yeah. Eventually this gets really gross and dirty and covered in propolis, just like everything else. And you'll have to clean the chimney part of it, just like you would clean a fireplace chimney. Okay. When you get into a hive the first time, whether it's with your mentor or when you get into your own hive, take a moment, calm yourself. I sing to myself and I sing for my bees. So if my bees are being grumpy and angry, I like sing the Kung Fu fighting song or whatever. I have weird coping things. Every beekeeper does different things to help keep themselves calm and be kind of loose and silly. Bees do feel vibrations. So when you're taking the hive apart, just be gentle, don't bang and thump around and stomp around because they can kind of feel that. The other thing is don't stand in front of the hive entrance. Bees are constantly coming and going, and you create like a little traffic jam when you stand in front of the entrance and they get all confused. When we work in our beehives, we work usually from the side or from the back of the hive. So these hives in this picture are all facing forwards. I wouldn't set my hives up like this because as a beekeeper getting into the hives, I want to be behind them. And it doesn't look like there's a whole lot of space behind them. And as you get into them, you're going to take them apart, set the lid upside down, and make a stack of the boxes you've looked through. So you almost need another space for another hive next to your hive where you're working to be able to set all that stuff out. And these hives are just so close together that would be really difficult. Yeah, and then keep track of the stuff where you set stuff down. Jeez. Okay. When you take apart your hive, you take the lid off, set it on the ground upside down, puff some smoke in to keep the bees calm, and then lift off that inner lid. They're usually by that point in time heads into the cells chowing down. Then you're going to pry off the inner lid. I like to set my lid in near the entrance so those bees that are crawling up have something to crawl up and then get back into the hive. And the lid smells like the hive, so that kind of helps them know. You can also, as you're lifting and setting boxes down, there's tools where you can set the frames as you take them apart. When you set those boxes down, setting them down at a 45-degree angle or a 90-degree angle, like off of each other, helps the bees to be able to move in and out. You can see with these hives, they're only touching on like 4 little points when you're setting the boxes down, so you have a much lower chance of squishing bees. The worst thing you can do is to set the box down really slowly and squish like 20 bees while doing it, because all those bees are going to panic, have time to release an alarm pheromone, and like trigger a bunch more bees, right? You want to be quick if you have to squish anybody, so they don't have a chance to release the alarm pheromone. And ideally, you do it in such a way where you don't squish anyone. So it's sort of a balance, being careful and fast so that nobody sets off alarms. Things to look for when you're looking. We talked a little bit about some of these eggs, larvae, capped brood. If it's domed on the top, that's our drone brood. And if it's more flat and maybe dimpled, that's worker brood. And when you see them side by side, it's very obvious. The drone brood looks just like Kix cereal. You will notice pollen and bee bread, and it'll be different colors of yellow to red, sometimes almost brown. Nectar is usually glossy and uncapped, and once it becomes honey and is dry and thick enough, then they'll cap it, and it's very wrinkly, like almost like a wrinkled skin of wax on top. Queen cells are usually textured like a peanut, a little bit smaller than a peanut, but they have that similar texture on the outside. Frequently, they're hanging from the bottom of the frame or maybe poking out from the side of the frame. The tricky thing, however, is that bees make their honeycomb at a 13-degree angle, and that's to hold in the nectar and prevent it from being able to drip out. But as a beekeeper, when you're looking inside these cells, looking for the little egg at the bottom, if you're looking straight on, you might not see it because they're very tiny and translucent. So sometimes you have to tilt the frame like away, so the bottom of the frame is away from you a little bit to be able to actually see all the way to the bottom of the cell to look for those little eggs. With youth, you can have them practice looking at pictures like we're going to here, and then have them practice identifying things in the hive where you do it, and then have them look for something. It's very much like a look and find. Okay, so in this picture, this image has really made the eggs very visible. Normally it can be tricky to tell these shiny ones from the ones with eggs, but you can see these eggs and then this freshly hatched little larva, some of them getting a little bit bigger. You can see these polished cells that are all ready for the queen to come and lay eggs. I think this is nectar, possibly bee bread, and then here's some nectar and bee bread in some of these other ones, and some more unfinished nectar. And then in this next one, we can see the 2 different types of capped brood. So over here we have our worker capped brood. See how these are sort of flat, maybe with a little dimple in the middle. And these are very round, and they're actually slightly larger. The holes for drones are a little bit larger. They're just bigger larvae. And you can see they look like Kix cereal. These uncapped ones, maybe they don't have an egg in them, or maybe there's a larva in there that's still developing. There's tons of worker bees here helping and feeding and capping these cells. And then in here we can see some older larvae. The older larvae, you almost can't tell that they're a little grub because they fill the space so well. This one's almost capped. And it's hard to, this is what you might see when you see that egg. Super tiny, kind of tricky to see. And here's some capped honey up here. You can see how it looks like there's a skin of wax over the surface. And looking through this one, this frame doesn't have plastic foundation that the bees build on. This one, the beekeeper just has them build the whole thing themselves. So looking through these, you can see the connections on the opposite side where there's comb facing out the other direction. And you can see up here, this is capped honey. We have maybe this is being prepared for brood, but you can also see with this one how it would be really difficult to see an egg in here just because of how the light's hitting it. The light would shine through it and make it difficult to see. You can see some larvae in these and some capped brood here. I don't see any drone capped brood. This all looks like worker brood to me. And here's some that's scattered drone brood. Some of these are big enough that they've capped them, and most of them are still larvae. And then up here, we've got some unfinished honey that's just nectar, and finished honey up here. They frequently do this sort of D-shaped pattern where we have kind of a rainbow with brood here, food resources in the little rainbow pattern, and then longer term storage food up here. And then they'll store whole frames of honey in the top of the hive. Okay, so could you keep bees? Is it even feasible for you? Ideally, you want to keep your beehives 15 feet away from paths and roads. This is where I have my hives in my front yard. They're up on cinder blocks to make it easier to mow and easier to reach. And this is my front yard. So people drive by and see me and my weird singing, talking to my bees. It's fine. They already know I'm kind of strange. And you'll also need space to store things. So even though I only have 2 hives, I do have enough boxes and frames to basically build an additional 2 hives. So I could have 4 because I'm always swapping out parts. When I'm looking into frames or harvesting honey, I need somewhere to set them down. And the easiest way to set them down is to put them in another hive box that's empty. So frequently beekeepers might have 5 hives, but enough materials for 10. And that can kind of drive up the cost. At first, you don't wind up with that much, but you just seem to collect a lot. Active season is like March through November. You'll need a water source. The costs can vary pretty wide. So materials, we already know these things. I'm going to kind of fly through this because I have so much more to say. The bees themselves are going to be $125 to $300 per hive. And then for your tools, you know, this much, and then a single beehive itself can be $100 to $380, depending on how much work you want to do and how much work you would just like to buy them already finished and everything. Typical smokers between $30 and $60. They're all pretty much the same. They might have different shaped tops, and beekeepers have opinions on that. I'm not experienced enough to have strong opinions. Frame holders are nice. My mentors didn't use these, but I inherited one that was like this, and it is very nice. As you pull frames out and check them, you can set them to the side, and it kind of keeps the frames in the same order, which the bees appreciate when you put them back in their order. They tend to fill the middle of the beehive up with brood, and then the outer layers they'll fill with honey. So if you need to mix it around, you can, but they like it when you put them back where they were. Some people 3D print smaller ones, or they have metal ones, or you can get them like this that are separated. This one is a little bit cumbersome to store, this bar that's here, but I like that they're always the right distance apart. With these ones, if they slid apart too far, your frames could fall off or something. And this one isn't going to slide apart. Other tools that hopefully you start thinking about before you get bees are mite control and disease control. This little tester can be between $20 and $30. It's really useful. You can also use a canning jar, a screen, and a lid to do basically a similar thing. This is called a sugar roll test. It's adorable and cute and very peculiar, but it's a way of separating mites from the bees and then counting them. So you can figure out in 100 bees, how many mites are there? And that is going to determine your treatment to get rid of mites. This is the treatment that I just barely used, but there's other varieties. And it's going to be a lot cheaper to do one treatment that's $30 to maybe $2 at most. and get rid of those mites than to risk losing your whole colony, which was like a couple $100s in bees. So definitely think about this and plan for this before you get bees. Don't do what I did. Okay, there's also feeders. This is a Boardman feeder. It sits on the front of the hive. Generally, you don't need to feed syrup if they have honey. But if you're harvesting honey regularly, or there's a season where there's not a lot of resources for them, or you have brand new bees and they need to get established, you're going to need to feed them sugar syrup. And a hive, a growing hive, can down a quart of syrup in a day. So they make feeders that are basically a frame with a little thing that bees can crawl up and down to get at the nectar, or you can do these. Most beekeepers are going to recommend that you do this inside the hive, but then you're going to need to have an empty box, basically like in here. I could have this sort of set up, fill it up with nectar, and then set it down inside an empty box so the bees could get up inside the hive. Why do you want to have it inside the hive? Because this syrup is going to attract not just your bees, but your neighbors' bees and wasps and all sorts of other things, which is not great. It can encourage them to then discover that your hive has more honey inside of it, and they can start robbing your hive of resources, especially if your hive is small and just starting out. So you want to discourage robbing. I eventually replaced these metal lids with these plastic ones because my metal lids kept rusting, and I hated the sound they made when I screwed them on when they're all rusty, and I decided plastic was better. And so far I really like the plastic ones. A bee brush isn't necessary. Some people use branches. Some people just sort of shake the bees off. If you just need to look at a specific area on the frame, you can actually blow gently and they'll move to the side for a second. So if I'm looking at a specific spot or I'm trying to find the queen or something, I can blow on them gently. But when I'm harvesting a frame of honey, I need all those bees off, and I need them off quickly, and I don't want to thump the frame around and hit stuff with it because I don't want it to be disturbing the hive and alerting them to the fact that I'm taking all of their honey. So having a bee brush to sweep the bees off, it doesn't hurt them, can be really quick, and they're not that expensive. I found this tool to be more useful than I thought it would be. Here's my hive tool. I like having a bowl to collect all those scraps that I scrape off. This is a mixture of propolis and beeswax that I mix with hot water, separated out the wax because it floats and the propolis sinks. And then I strained the wax through a piece of fabric, and then I had a chunk of usable beeswax from all my scraps. Now I could melt this down and put more of it back on my frames to let my bees use it, or I can add it to soap or lotion when I make that. Realistically, my daughter has used it for sculpting, so that works too. There's also queen catchers, which are useful for if you're able to find your queen, capturing her, maybe putting a colored dot of paint on her so she's easier to find in the future, or if you need to replace her or remove her or take her out of the hive for a little bit, it can be a safe way to do that. These are probably the cheapest ones. These glass pipes are probably the more expensive ones. There's lots of videos on how to use them. You don't need to be able to find your queen to be a beekeeper, though. You can look for signs that she's alive, and eventually you can develop your queen identifying skills. You don't need to be concerned about being able to find the queen bee right away. You'll know that she's there because you'll see the eggs. So that's the cost. I would say for 2 hives and supplies, $1,500 is a pretty good estimation. Maybe you could do it cheaper, especially if you're good with wood and you have a wood shop and can make your own bee box and all that. But it's not cheap to get started beekeeping. The other question is, do you have the plants to support bees? Bees are foragers and they need something to eat. Chances are, if you live in a neighborhood, you have more resources than you even realize. There is this publication that's at this QR code is fabulous. It's called Gardening for Honeybees. It's produced by the DNR, and it is a list of perennials, trees, annuals, native plants, and whether they provide pollen, nectar, or resources, and what season they provide those things to the bees. And it's fabulous. Go around your yard, identify your big trees, because trees are one of the major food sources for bees. They produce more flowers, more nectar, more pollen than our smaller, stubbier perennials and annuals do. Again, this time of year, goldenrod and asters are huge for our bees. That fall bump in pollen availability and nectar really helps them get through the winter. So having access to those is good. But you can also figure out what plants you might want to add to your yard or your neighbor's yard if you can convince them to join you in planting for your bees. Really fun activities could include taking your kids around and identifying the trees in your neighborhood that your bees might use. And right now, when we go on walks, we like to look for honeybees. We're the only people that we know of in our neighborhood that have bees. So we assume that all the bees we see are ours, but that might not be true. And so we'll say, look, it's one of our bees when we're on walks, which is really fun. What should you be doing in which season? So this is where I made a lot of mistakes because I got into beekeeping kind of last minute in April. So I had my bees and then realized that they needed to be in a more level location. So you can only move bees either 3 feet or 3 miles, or you'll confuse them. So I knew I needed to have my beehive not really move very far, but I needed it in a more level spot because they were building their comb kind of wonky and the water wasn't draining off of them as it was raining. The water was sort of sitting in the bottom of the hive. So I needed them to be pitched forward just this right amount. So behind them I went and I dug us. It was all in the pouring rain, which was not ideal either. And I laid sort of a brick foundation and then cinder blocks, and I built it up, made it a little bit taller and definitely more level. And I had to do all of that while my bees were there. And that would be not a great thing. I would love to have avoided that. So if in the fall you decide you want bees, you can make your apiary plans. Where are you going to have the hives? What are they going to sit on? What are they going to be on so they don't rot out on the bottom or you don't attract mice? Plan for your apiary to grow. Most beekeepers wind up with a couple hives. So having space that exceeds that a little bit is good. Get your hive boxes, paint them, prep them beforehand, not the night before when staying up super late and then not giving the paint enough time to cure, like I did, right? Don't do that. And for kids, have them help with this process, with the planning and the painting and making the boxes. It's fun. There's gluing and screwing and nailing and putting it together. And then once you have it together, you get to paint it. This little thing in the front is called an entrance reducer. I forgot to mention that. It's so that when the hive population is low, it sort of helps them not have as much space to guard. And then as they get bigger, then you can open that entrance and take this little piece of wood out. And they can get in and out easier without a traffic jam and still have enough and still be able to protect that space. You'll also have to put all your frames together, which is more nailing, gluing, and slipping the little plastic sheets in. This is when I painted. If I did it again, I would not paint this top part because then when you stack the boxes, the paint sort of sticks in addition to the propolis. I would have just left that raw wood if I did it again. I also did fun designs on mine and then painted that. I mixed a little bit of acrylic paint in with white exterior paint to get a bigger variety of colors without having to go and buy a bunch of different color samples. And this was what my hives looked like. I also added a hole and then put a little piece of screen. You can leave the hole open or screen, it doesn't matter, to improve ventilation in the top of the hive. Sometimes moisture can build up under here and create a little bit of a mold problem, especially in the rainier or cooler seasons. And having a tiny bit of controlled ventilation helps. And then you can remove that when you need to or cover it with insulation or something. So then come spring, when you have your hive boxes all ready and everything set up, order your bees. You can either get a package, a nuke, or a colony. I would recommend getting a nucleus colony. They'll come with 5 frames, usually in like a little plastic or wood box like these ones in the back of my car. And then you just put those frames inside the hives and let them get adjusted, and that it's pretty easy. You could also order a package of bees, which is just 3 pounds of bees, again with the weight measurement because you don't want to count them. And then you'll get the queen, usually in a little box with a cap on the box that's got some, like sometimes it's an actual marshmallow. And the bees will get accustomed to her pheromones and eat through that sugar and then have access to her when there's less risk of them killing her because she doesn't smell like what they expect. A lot of times the packages of bees are freshly bred queens that have been mated that are then added with 3 pounds of bees, and you stick them in your thing, but then they have to draw out all that comb on the frames. Whereas with a nucleus colony, you get the frames with the honeycomb built on the frames. And frequently there's brood on those frames too. So the colony gets a little bit of a head start versus a package. But packages are cheaper and can be shipped more easily. So you can order packages of bees from larger bee companies in other states. Nucleus colonies, usually you order from a local bee breeder, basically. If you attend SEBA meetings or join the Beekeepers of Indiana, you will have an easier time finding local people that breed bees to buy from. In the summer, you're going to want to support their rapid growth. You'll want to have extra boxes on hand and be checking for mites, overcrowding, which will then, that's when you put another box on so they can spread out. Definitely test for mites as you go. And if you can't keep honeybees, you can promote native bees by having those plants in your yard and not spraying things that will kill them and leaving some of that plant material for them to overwinter. This little guy down here on my lamb's quarters is not technically a native bee, it's an introduced bee, it's a wool carder bee. But each of them have fascinating interactions with the plants that live around us, and a lot of them might not even look like bees to us, but as we learn more about bees, we can appreciate them and help protect them too. Okay, so questions. I'm sorry that went over, and I will unmute you all. Let's see if I can. So if you guys have questions, you can ask them. Or if you have to go, that's fine too.
Okay, I have a question. I may have missed it. Do the hives have to be around the floral, the plants, or because I've seen them out in the middle of a field? How far do the bees fly?
They can fly a couple miles. It's
Okay.
good if the foliage is right up against the hive. There is a theory that they actually have a harder time communicating where that resource is because of their communication dance. Struggles to describe things that are right next to the hive. But so it's almost better if the forage is a little bit farther away, like a couple 100 feet maybe. But you can have it right up against the beehives too. And then having clumps of resources is really good because then they don't have to fly so far. You can even, I heard of this one guy that had hives at the top of like a, I don't know, 10-story building or something. But the problem with that then is that the beehives up here, the bees come out and have to fly all the way down, get resources and fly all the way back up. And by the time they're back up, they've almost used a lot of the nectar and stuff that they've acquired just flying back up to the hive. So you can have them on roofs to a certain extent. They still need to be able to get out to where they need to forage. The other thing is, in an urban setting, you can put your hive and sort of have it, if you have the entrance of the hive maybe a couple feet from a fence, that's fine because you don't need to be on the entrance side really. And when the bees come out, instead of making that bee line, right? That's where the word comes from. Instead of making a beeline to wherever their resource is, they'll fly up, circle around maybe like 30 feet in the air or so, and then go to the resource, which can be really good if you're maybe right next to your driveway or you don't have a whole lot of space. Placing that hive up against a fence and encouraging them to fly up and then go to the resource prevents them from crossing paths where humans frequently are. So sometimes I've seen beekeepers build like a little enclosure around their hives just to get them to fly up so that they don't bother pedestrians if they're close to a space like that.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah,
And
thanks for the question.
Yeah, I've got another one.
Yeah, go ahead.
And it was funny because I was talking to a friend, they're coming in for the Purdue game tomorrow, and one of the guys that is coming up just started hives, and I think he's more in town. They're from Kentucky, So he said once he started his hive, his neighbors could not spray their lawn anymore. I mean, are there laws? I mean, if somebody told me I can't spray my lawn, that almost tell me to double spray it, you know, but what are
Yeah.
there laws like that?
There aren't laws that prevent it, but if you, and ideally you register your hives on something called Drift Watch or something similar, then people who come to spray for insects are required to notify you. So I have my hives registered on Drift Watch. When people come to spray for, usually it's for mosquitoes in our neighborhood. When people come to spray for mosquitoes, I'll get a notification through my email or my preferred contact saying that, they're going to come and spray. And then they're also encouraged to spray ideally in the evening when my bees are back in the hive and less likely to be exposed. Still not like great. But that's with pesticides, things that are, or insecticides. With herbicides, most herbicides won't affect bees too much unless they get like actually coated with the stuff. Spraying, Roundup on your weeds or whatever when the bees aren't, like you're not actually spraying the bees, will be fine.
Okay,
It's not a pesticide that's intended to harm their system unless they're like exposed to a huge dose of it.
very good.
So yeah, there shouldn't be any laws that prevent people, especially from spraying for weeds.
Good. Now, are you gonna send out these slides? And I did not notice any type of information where we can go, like to find out more stuff.
Yeah, I can send out the slides and I am gonna put the recording of this online for people to rewatch. But sure, I can send out, and I didn't include a whole lot of links, but I can include links when I finish the slides to the things that I mentioned.
Very good.
Yeah. Oh, and I should add my email too, and then you can email me more questions if you think of
Right.
more. Okay. Well, if no one has any more questions, I will call it good and I will send that information out. Thanks for coming, everyone.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.